Hey, everybody. We're back with another Bible study, taking a look at how to read the Bible and then really spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. The study is called How to Read the Bible, a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. And today is an interesting one because today we're taking a look at the biblical book of Job. And Job is a strange book in a lot of ways, and a lot of people know Job because it's a book that we say helps us to answer the question about why do bad things happen to good people. There's been volumes written about that subject and a lot of wisdom that's out there. And Job is an interesting case study. Let's just jump right into it where we take a look at Job. If you're in a small group setting, this is a great time to answer these questions about what do you know about Job, what happened, who's in it, probably Job, and then when did it happen? List as many facts as you can. So go ahead if you're in a group setting and hit pause now. For those of us joining live, we're going to get into Job and we look at it. A little fun fact about Job is that it's probably the oldest book of the Bible in terms of historically when it was written. A lot of scholars can take a look at some of the some of the vocabulary and the words that are used and when those words were used elsewhere and start to kind of get a sense of when the book was written. And we see that the book was probably one of the most ancient ones around, maybe even the first book of the Bible that was written, kind of suggesting that these books, the questions that we're answering are some of the, like, why do bad things happen to good people, are some of the oldest questions that have been asked of God's people. Let's take a look now by the summary of Job. We see that it's set in the land of Uz, which is super far away from Israel. I brought a map here just to kind of take a look. In the green there, you can see is the land of Uz. In the green is the land of Israel generally. Uz is in the red. I just put an arrow there. It's off the map. It's way far away from Israel, which is probably going to be important. All the characters in the story, including Job, seem to be from a non-Israelite or non-Hebrew Jewish background. And also there's no clear historical setting, which means a lot of the stories start off with, think about the kings. The kings references not only the kings of Israel, but also the kings of Assyria and the kings of Egypt, the kings of Babylon, just all kinds of different kings, which anchors it in a specific time and place. Job seems to intentionally have done none of that to kind of keep it free from all of the historical ties around, probably including historical, but also geographic ties around, probably to suggest that the questions that we're going to be asking this morning, why do bad things happen to good people, that these are questions that people have been asking all over the world. And there's no specific geographical boundary to these questions, and there's no particular timeliness or chronological boundary to the questions that we're going to ask, is that they are timeless and that they are not bound by geography. We'll jump into the content of the book of Job to take a look at it. Job is introduced in chapters 1 and 2. This is the prologue. Job is found to be blameless and righteous. He honors God. He's transported to this, and then he's immediately transported to these heavenly realms where God is holding court. He's kind of like running the universe, the whole universe. And we see this important character called Satan enter the picture. He makes his appearance. Now, literally, the word isn't always a name like we have now. Satan, everybody knows who that is, the horns and the pitchfork. Not a biblical image, by the way. But we have literally his name translates to he's the accuser, or maybe he's the prosecutor, which kind of makes sense because what's unfolding is, after all, a court scene where God presents Job as a righteous person. And Satan, the accuser, claims that Job is only righteous because God has been blessing him. And so Satan, the accuser, the prosecutor, says, listen, if you're to remove the protection from him, then all of the those blessings that you take away, you'll start to see that Job would fall away as well, which is a kind of important concept when we ask the question, are we following God for his blessings or for his person? And so the accuser, Satan, says, hey, God, pull away your blessings from Job, and I know that he'll turn away. And then God agrees. which is like, what? That's pretty wild that God would go ahead and agree to that. All right, we assume that God will answer the question, why does God allow suffering? Everybody knows that's what like Job is known for. And so then you think that God is going to answer that question. But I just want to give you a spoiler. The book of Job in its 42 chapters is not going to answer that question. It's not going to answer why does God allow suffering. It's going to answer a better, deeper question, the one that we're all asking for. As an interesting side note, the accuser, Satan, inverts, kind of flips the question on its head, and it poses it to all of us, is do we follow God for him or his blessings? And what the accuser does is to simply point out that you don't really know. Like you can't ultimately be 100% sure until you separate them, until you separate God and his blessings, until you only have one. Timothy Keller said, you don't realize that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. And so it's kind of an interesting thought experiment for all of us is, do you follow God for him or for his blessings? And then quickly on the heels of that, do you really know until you separate them? Oh. All right, so the real question here in the book of Job isn't why do bad things happen to good people? It's deeper than that. It's, is God just? Is he running the world according to justice? And we find out that the reason for Job's suffering is never actually revealed in the book of Job. Let's just jump in. Some of the characters. We've got Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. They're significant only because they're not Jewish names. They're not part of the Israelite people. But they do represent the best of ancient thinking. The land of Uz is probably kind of around like where the Garden of Eden would be. It's maybe a stand-in for saying the wisdom that we have given to us in Job, it's going to be kind of like this deep wisdom, the wisdom that has been around since the beginning of creation. And so this is going to be the best kind of wisdom posed to Job for the reason of his suffering. We look at Job 3, verse 30, or chapters 3 to 37. It's kind of the meat of the book, the middle part of the book. I'm calling it the world's wisdom, where you have this conversation, this dialogue between Job and his friends, and you see the best possible explanations that the world has come up with for why Job is suffering the way that he is. And there's 3 cycles. A friend makes a statement, Job responds to the statement, repeat in these chapters. Focus on these, the statements from the friends focus on these questions. Is God just? Does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And how is Job's suffering to be explained? All right, so we're working on the assumption that everything that happens will happen according to a strict justice system. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Job's argument, he goes to God, that he's innocent. Remember, he's blameless. He's trustworthy. He's righteous. He's a stand-up guy. Job is innocent. Therefore, his suffering is not divine justice. Remember, he didn't do anything wrong. Therefore, God does not run the world according to justice. Therefore, God is ultimately unjust. That's what Job lays out. Now, his friends, kind of the world's wisdom, comes back to that one. No. God is just. God does run the world according to justice. And they conclude, therefore, Job must have really done something bad. I mean, he must have done something awful to bring upon him the loss of his family, servants, his farm, and then ultimately like his own health. I mean, Job, what was it that you did something terrible? Job, in his frustration with his friends, takes his case back to God, and he's all over the place. He's so emotional. He's on this roller coaster of emotions. He's all over. He goes, I believe that God is just, or at least I want to believe that God is just. I think that God is responsible for all the evil in the whole world. It's like, wait, what? I can't believe I just said that. Now I'm terrified of God. And then he ends it with, I'm demanding that I get an audience with God, which is kind of a big ask, like a personal appearance of God. And then there's this new friend that shows up. His name is Elihu. And that's interesting because it's a Hebrew name. So we've got some of the Israelite kind of wisdom trickling trickling in here, that God's people wisdom is trickling in. And Elihu says something interesting. He says that God is just, that God does run the world according to justice, just like the friends were arguing, but that this suffering may be a warning from God to avoid sin, or maybe to build character. Maybe there's something that we're missing, something that we don't quite know of, that doesn't necessarily mean, Job, that you did something really bad. That's a good response, good insight by that guy Elihu. And then in Job 38-41, God steps on the scene, and God shows up to Job and actually grants him that audience that Job was asking for. And that's what makes this book so exceptional, is that God actually does answer Job's request, but not at all in the way that he was anticipating. In chapters 38-41, God takes Job on this tour of the universe. Sample verse out of that one is God telling Job, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked it off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across the whole earth and its foundations?" He says, Job, have you ever architected the universe? Have you ever commanded a sunrise? Have you ever organized a constellation? And then he goes to these really intricate little details. So he starts like really, really grand, really big, and then he kind of funnels it into these really intricate details, like the grazing habits of goats and deer giving birth, and the feeding patterns of donkeys. Essentially, God is saying, Job, there's so much more to this whole universe than your perspective of it and the perspective of your friends. And he starts really wide with the constellations and commanding the sunrise, and architecting the universe, is stretching the measuring line across the universe. And then he goes really narrow, and he talks about the goats and deer and grazing patterns of donkeys. And he says, I know, God is saying, I know, and I have context and I have perspective for the really, really grand things in the universe. I also have a perspective on the really, really intricate small things of the universe. Job, and who are you? Do you want to do this job? Do you think that you can do this job? Well, the point here that God is making is that Job and his friends have such a limited perspective, wide enough to think that they understand, but far too narrow to actually comprehend the intricacies of the universe. There's no way that they possibly can. But because they're human and because they can understand some things, they're tricked into thinking that they can have a wide enough perspective to understand the universe. So what looks like divine injustice must be seen in the context of an infinite perspective. Like, how are you to judge God, Job, when your perspective is so narrow? And then God gives this fun illustration of the behemoth and the leviathan, which are these two ancient mythical creatures. And I don't want you to get hung up on like what exactly these things are, or why that God mentioned them, or where they're used elsewhere in the Bible. That's not really the point. The point is about these two animals are symbols of disorder and danger. The way that they're talked about in the Bible is that they're not evil. God actually loves them, but he doesn't call them safe either. And they're kind of a stand-in for how God created the world. You think about the world, and I think you'd probably agree with this, is that God's world is good, but it's not perfected. It's not done. It's ordered, but it's not wild. It's ordered, but it is wild. It's beautiful, but the world is also a very dangerous place. You ask the question, why is there suffering? Well, we live in an amazing world, and God answers with, it isn't designed to prevent suffering, at least not at this stage. God promises a world to come called heaven that is designed to alleviate that suffering once and for all, making everything sad come untrue, wiping away every tear. That world is coming, but this world is not that world. When we encounter suffering in this world, it should make us long for and crave that next world, a world yet on its way. So what God does is, in the meantime, he asks for trust. And then there's a wrap up in Job 42, the last chapter, is that Job comes before God after all of this, and he offers his humility. He offers his repentance. God says that the friends were wrong all along, and God still approves. That should be of Job. Honesty in prayer is the right posture. We talk about that at Encounter sometimes. Orthodoxy, which is believing the right things. Orthopraxy, which is doing the right things. And orthoposture, which is how do you come before God? Or what's the right way to come before other people? And then all these blessings come to Job, just kind of heaped on. Double the children, double the animals, the farmland, the blessings of God. He gets it all back and then some. And so we find that our search for reasons will be far too simplistic and small. So instead of demanding an explanation of God, the lesson of Job is to offer God trust in the meantime, from this world to that. The theme of Job is that God doesn't promise an explanation for suffering. Instead, he asks for trust. Where do you spot Jesus in a book like Job? Well, Jesus brings extreme clarity to Job. I heard one time that to the answer to the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And the answer is, they typically don't. It only happened once, and that person volunteered. That person, of course, being Jesus. He brings a lot of clarity to Job. If anybody can object to God's action, it would be God's Son. No one was more perfect, yet no one suffered more. Jesus clarifies that there's not always a connection between suffering and goodness. A perfect person could still end up suffering. That connection point isn't nearly as clear and defined as sometimes we'd like to think it is, or we'd like to believe that it is. It's not always there. Is that Jesus also shows that God still rules with justice, just not our sense of justice. You see, we want dark, heavy lines connected to evil. Immediately, evil happens and the evil person is punished. We want dark, heavy lines connected to goodness and blessings. We do something good and we are immediately rewarded for it. We would love all of this, but like a child or a parent would love having those connections. Do something bad, get discouraged for it, get punished. Do something good, get rewarded. But then we grow up and we learn that the world is far more complicated as an adult, and sometimes those lines aren't quite so clear and they're not quite so immediate as we once thought they were. And we back it up and we grow up even more in God's perspective, and we start to find out that it's even more complicated and more nuanced and more intricate. And God responds to some of the injustice and evil in the world. Instead of with an immediate, swift punishment like we learned when we were toddlers, or instead of a delayed punishment that we learned as adults, God's perspective is sometimes the punishment falls on him, and he in turn offers forgiveness. It's still justice, no less justice, but it's not our sense of what would be fair. So some group questions to talk about, either in your group or on the chat, or some of the bad things that happened to Job. Was Job really righteous and blameless? I like that question number 5. Why did God separate himself from his blessings in Job's life? Was it necessary? Is it necessary in my life? An important takeaway, number 7, of Job is that our perspective is far too small to make judgment calls on God's justice. How can we move from expecting an explanation to offering God our trust? What's the practical action steps that we can take instead of demanding an explanation from God, which is something intrinsic to all of us? What's a practical step that we could take to move towards, okay, God, instead of expecting an explanation, I'm just going to offer you my trust? I'm not sure, but I think gratitude is going to play a key role in number 7. All right, guys, thanks for stopping by and joining us. We'll see you next time, next week, Wednesday at noon.